So we are now in our fourth chapter, our fourth of the series in Ecclesiastes. And we have this author who speaks as king, he speaks as teacher, he speaks as preacher. The word Ecclesiastes translates to the one who assembles, that gathers. So for our purposes today, we'll speak of him as our teacher. In chapter 1, we heard of his struggle of labor and striving after wisdom. It left the teacher realizing that so much of that was vain and empty. Pastor Todd invited us to think about what we desire and how it affects us. In chapter 2, we learned about the teacher trying what we call the eat, drink, and be merry lifestyle. Essentially, trying anything that could please him. And again, he found an emptiness. And then last week, we looked at chapter 3. The teacher came to realize that there's a season for everything. And the invitation to us was that we accept the changing seasons of our lives and also focus on the present moment. In all of this, our teacher had access to a lot of things that bring pleasure, things that bring wisdom. Essentially, you could say he tried the world's ways and he tried the church's ways. And what came of it? He didn't get answers. Instead, he concluded that there's much emptiness in these things on their own. And how does he come to this awareness? Well, it may have struck some of you already, but this particular teacher was very privileged. Not everyone gets all the opportunities that he had. And this may make us a little bit uncomfortable today, but I ask you to stick with me for a bit. Because we are privileged. Demographically speaking, we live in one of the wealthiest parts of the world. Not just the country, but the world. And we are an overly educated bunch. And we give opportunity for additional education. If you think of the wonderful things that we do, we have a women's book group that reads a new book every month. We have adult discipleship. We have missional community groups that have an aspect of education. And of course, we teach our children about the Lord's ways in various ways and methods. This is beautiful. This is wonderful. I am not complaining about this gift. I'm just inviting us to recognize that not everyone lives with the same kind of privilege. Now, you may think, but I'm a part of the lower income bracket. Of course. You may think, but I didn't even finish high school. And among us, there are many variations of education and economic status and all the other statuses. That's not entirely the point. I'm just inviting us to see if there might be a connection with our teacher who lived a privileged life and has learned many things. So what does he do with his privilege? This is always what's so important. He turns his attention to the oppression and the suffering of the world. In verse 1, he looks at the oppression, and what does he say? He says, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressors, and they have no comforter. So he names the truth that both oppressed people and those who oppress suffer. Oppression does not bring wellness for anyone. It doesn't bring comfort. It simply brings suffering. So our teacher suggests that this suffering is so great on both the victim and the perpetrator's sides of this oppression. And he suggests that it would be better for them never to have been born. Now that may seem a little dramatic to some, but honestly, it's a human emotion that many people who experience different levels of oppression feel. So I find it beautiful that our sacred texts include it and name it. I'm not sure if you've ever felt the weight of a certain kind of oppression, or if you've sat with a person who has. They will tell you that there are moments that they wish they had never been born. So we can appreciate that it's included in our text. I ask you just to take a moment to think of those who are oppressed. Who comes to your mind? It's okay if the first person you thought of was yourself. Perhaps you're struggling under the weight of something today that is heavy. Sally mentioned the heavy laden burden that life sometimes throws at us, right? Perhaps it's someone in your family, someone you love dearly. Maybe it's a friend or a neighbor. Or maybe you thought of a people group that is suffering from something that tugs at your heart, that whenever you hear about it, you see it. There's some connection to knowing and realizing that suffering is real. Some of the oppression in the Bible is the same today, sadly. There's slavery then, there is now. There is a lack of awareness around widows and orphans, those in foster care, poor in spirit, poor in material goods, those who live outside, the travelers, and the refugees. Sadly, they're still a part of the groups that are oppressed today. In 1990, Iris Marion Young offered the world in her book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, 5 faces of oppression. She suggests that they are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Now, regardless of if you agree with her, I just want to help us think through some of the levels of oppression. Again, our sacred text today invites us to think about these things. And there's often a connection to privilege and oppression. So we just want to be honest about it today. We just want to name it. And I will be the first to tell you, our church does many, many things to care for the less privileged. I think about just the professions among us. We have medical and psychological professionals who care for the physically ill, who care for the mentally ill. We have educators from preschool all the way through to the universities. And they are educating and teaching and encouraging and coming alongside students of various levels. And we have clergy, we have chaplains, we have spiritual directors, we have mentors. Some that are official and some that are just caring for the child down the street. So we are doing this good work. When I was in Kansas City recently for the clergy conference, I had the pleasure of hearing from one of the priests. Her name is Reverend Lisa Durr, and she is running the C4SO prison ministry. It's a prison initiative. It's called Hope on the Inside. And Reverend Durr established this to nurture and build faith communities inside prisons. The inmates having their own forms of worship. She and her team come alongside it, and she and her team train others. The stories she shared were incredible. There's also another organization I'm aware of that is called the Compassion Prison Ministry. And they go into prisons and teach people about trauma. They teach the inmates about the trauma and how their adverse childhood experiences affected who they are today, how they got to where they are, and what they might do differently. They also train the staff. They're transforming prisons from the inside out with this information. And one of the things that they do, that a lot of prison ministries do, is they allow their volunteers, after an application and process, to write letters to the inmates. And I know within our community, we have people who do this. Maybe not with this particular organization, but they write letters to inmates and receive letters. And what I've heard and what I know is that this relationship is a blessing on both sides. It certainly helps with the isolation that inmates feel, but there's this reciprocal blessing of getting to know one another. And certainly there are many other organizations doing fabulous things. These are just a couple examples. We also know that not all oppression can be fought by simply doing something, taking some kind of action. And what we learned last week is the present moment is often the gift we can offer. Sometimes remaining in the present moment with someone is all they need, especially when the oppression is something like a chronic illness or a chronic pain that cannot be fixed. I've heard it over and over and over again from the chaplains in our midst and my chaplain friends that offering your present self is a gift. And this ties right into the rest of our Ecclesiastes passage. Our teacher goes on to speak about the hard work and ambition of having more and doing more. And what he uncovers is this unhealthy motivation of envy in all of that striving. Again, he names things for us. So I wonder if we just take a moment to think about, where do we find envy in our work, in our relationships, in our lives? Our teacher is also very quick to encourage us that the answer is not to stop working. He names that as foolishness. His antidote to working too much and not enough is a quietness. Some translate this word to rest. So he's encouraging us to work, but also to peaceful rest. The rhythm that we try to encourage here, right? One of our values is rest. When you come here on a Sunday, we hope and we are doing everything to encourage you to rest in the Lord's presence. So all that we've read up to this point leads the teacher to realize life is best shared in community, in relationship with others. Our teacher shares about one person we might call the workaholic, or the do more, be more, try more. Sadly, this person has no family. And specifically, the teacher mentions no son or no brother. And culturally, why that's important is when the person died, typically his inheritance would go to his son, and if there was no son, to his brother. So here this person, this example, is working and striving and doing and never content with the wealth he's building, but then in the end has no one to share it with while he's alive or even when he dies. Our teacher goes on to speak about two working together and how much better it is. Even the simple idea of when one falls, how much easier it is to get up. Anyone who's fallen knows that. There is something really special about working together in partnership. Thomas, if you would, I've asked permission to take these photos and share them. These ones, and then one more slide. So these are some fun photos. You don't have to keep them up for long. What I wanted you to see, I spoke about this the last time I was with you all, about two of our missional community groups coming to help my mother, who is a widow, and who needed some help around her gardens. And they took their day off, their half a day Saturday, and showed up to help her. And I can tell you personally how much it meant to me and how beautiful it was to connect with them. We shared a meal, we talked, we laughed. We did all the gardening things together as well. This is just an example of working together and easing the weight of the workload. Our teacher also speaks of the physical warmth of sleeping together. And again, this was a very practical example he was giving for his time. That moment in time, they couldn't just turn on the heater if someone got cold. So this was really obvious and relatable to the people hearing this for the first time and the second time and ongoing in that era. And as a king, he was probably very aware of wars and battles, and clearly knew that one alone is incredibly vulnerable. But when there's another, you can defend yourself much better. So while those two examples may not feel like something we can relate to, they're an invitation. They're this reminder of two being better than the one. And that invitation is to community. Over and over, it's to partnership. And it's not just about marriage. It's not just about parent and child or siblings, though absolutely those. But it's also about friendships and partnerships and who you're working with, who you're doing God's good work with. Our teacher is giving us a remedy of sorts that goes beyond just the crying out to the Lord. Our psalm today was a beautiful example of crying out to the Lord, which is typically a really great starting point. But the invitation is then to also some action. And this way of working together, decreases suffering. And there's something special about what's considered this little proverb right in the center of our text today. It reads, "A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken." Certainly, some of us have heard this one over and over, and certainly we can think of adding another person to the partnership. But I would invite us to really think about the Holy Spirit as being that third person that is always in our relationships, whether we pay attention or not. And that adds a whole other level of power and of care and of love and of all the fruits of the Spirit to our relationships, right? So I wonder where in your life you may be lacking partnerships or quality friendships. Do you have someone that you share the good work that you're doing with? Celtic spirituality has a term for something called soul friendship. These relationships are often shared where two people share their innermost hopes and dreams, their fears, their confessions, their longings, their desires. These relationships take intention, they take vulnerability, and they take consistency. And I can say they're very powerful. Personally, I've experienced them, and I've sat with people who have told me about these kinds of friendships. They're really, really important. Do you have someone in your life that you connect with on that level? My prayer would be that you all do, because it's so important. So David Benner, in his book, Sacred Companions, suggests a few things that we can do to build these relationships. Should we not? Should it just not come natural to us? He says, make a priority of asking questions rather than providing answers. This is really good when people are suffering as well, because sometimes you can't explain away the suffering. He also recommends listening prayerfully. And he recommends that you provide a climate of support and acceptance. Now, anyone who's experienced that knows what that feels like. He goes on to say, when appropriate, usually after you've built a relationship, sometimes it's really great to add in a spiritual practice, something like Lectio Divina, together, where your focus is on God, not even the current situations that you're in. These are, again, just ideas. They're ideas to spark our imagination today about the kind of community we can continue to foster and build here. So much of this is happening in our midst, and I'm thrilled to know that and to say that. And there's always more that we can do, right? So one example of something happening in our midst is our prayer team prays regularly. You know, the prayer cards, we're regularly praying, and at least one person had the idea to add fasting to our prayer practice. Then they shared it with another, and there are at least 3 people that regularly, on one day of the week, are not just praying for all of our needs, but we're also fasting. And that, again, is an example of partnering together. Because, as some of you know, fasting is not the easiest thing to do in the world. To deny oneself of the things we want goes against our eat, drink, and be merry, right? So again, it's that helpful little thing that it adds an accountability, it adds a participation, it adds just being able to connect with someone and be like, oh yeah, I'm doing that, we're doing that together. We also have a prayer quilt ministry. And so you'll see in this back table back here in our kind of prayer section are 2 quilts that you'll all be invited to participate in today. And it's a simple prayer and action step. You go to the quilt, you pray over the person or the family that the quilt is going to, and you tie a knot. And when you tie that knot, what that helps is the family or the person that receives the quilt can see how many people are caring for them. It's not just, oh, I'm praying for you. It's this whole community that is praying for and with them. Now again, these things, these little prayer activities may not seem like we're fighting oppression, but we are. We absolutely are. And these are the ways in which the Lord tugs on our heart to do more and to take action where we can. But prayer has to be the foundation, right? Because what do we not want to do? We don't want to just start doing the more, just to do the more, just to be the more. No, the invitation from the Spirit is always that still small voice. And it should not add burden. Jesus invites us in our gospel passage to one more layer of this that we want to look at. And it's often the hardest part. Jesus specifically asks us to love our enemies. So when you think of the worst forms of oppression and suffering, what's your posture? What's your attitude? What's your heart response to the oppressor? It's very easy to have our heart wrenched for those that are suffering, but the one that actually is causing the oppression. And Jesus' answer is always the same, right? For Jesus, it is always to love. But he takes it further in this Sermon on the Mount when he says, love your enemies. It's a requirement. It's part of our gospel message. It's what we give to the world. And it's not just sentimental love, it's action. So as we seek to alleviate oppression, and as we seek to alleviate the suffering, we must never leave the oppressed out. They too are absolutely loved by God. And they're in need of God's care, clearly. They wouldn't be doing what they're doing. And we know from some of the best reconciliation efforts in the world that when we don't forget about them, it is much better. So in closing, I would ask, will you respond to God's simple invitation today? to look honestly at any place in your life that feels privileged or that feels like you're doing too much or trying to be too much. And just wonder with the Lord, might there be something I could do differently to aid in caring for those suffering? Or today the invitation may be to name the oppression that you are suffering from or with. This is a community that wants to be with you in that. Our prayer team is lovely to go during Eucharist and after the service to get prayer. We have pastors and clergy that are willing to meet with you. You do not have to suffer in silence or alone. And there is healing. And what we've learned in this chapter is the best way forward is in community with each other. So I speak these things to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.